Hi everyone. Can everyone hear me okay? Great. I'm Habiba and I'm a project lead at the Rights Collective. Welcome to part 2 of our Forgotten Histories Partition Remembered teach-in. Thank you all for joining us this evening, and a special thanks to our wonderful speakers for agreeing to be a part of our panel. I'd like to inform you all that we are recording this teach-in to share on our website and social media for people who couldn't attend today. So if you feel more comfortable removing your video, then that's completely fine. Please also feel free to use the chat box function below. We are encouraging you to interact with the other participants and ask lots of questions and comments. And we're also encouraging you to use the plus sign. So if you agree with something one of the speakers is saying, or you think they're making a really good point, just feel free to drop plus signs in the chat box function. So the more pluses you give, the more you're supporting the person that's speaking. So that's great. Finally, if you'll be posting about the events on social media, please feel free to tag us on the Rights Collective and use the hashtag Partition Remembered so we can repost your tweets and see all of your posts. So for those of you who are new to the Rights Collective, we are a group of South Asian women who are working towards tackling the distinct and often subtle ways in which women's disempowerment and inequality manifests within the South Asian diaspora in the UK, and we look at both the public and private domains. We absolutely believe it is our duty to dismantle the ways in which these norms operate in our spaces, and we do that by 3 ways. So number 1, we break the silence. That means we seek to focus on understanding the lived experiences within our communities, and we build trust and strong relationships amongst our peers and create safe spaces to allow individuals to talk about their experiences more openly and honestly. Number 2, we create and cultivate a new culture. So that means we raise awareness of the oppressive structures that exist in the world that also replicate themselves in our communities that allow gender inequality to manifest. And number 3, we co-create spaces for support. So we are working towards bringing together a hub of support services that might support women in our communities in times of need. So having had individuals reach out to us, we recognize the need for a robust resource that can guide them when we are unable to support directly. We are hosting today's event on partition with a focus on remembering some of the forgotten stories. We feel as though some of the narratives around partition gives a sort of singular story and flattens the experiences of marginalized communities in South Asia who we know were also affected by partition. So our speakers this evening will be focusing on some of those themes and focusing on some of the less prominent understandings around partition. Our speakers will speak for about 7 to 10 minutes, depending on their choice, on their topic, followed by questions at the end, which you can post on the chat function. So I'm excited to actually introduce our first speaker today, who is Amrits Wilson. Amrit is a renowned activist and writer on issues of gender and race. Her books on South Asian women in Britain include Finding a Voice, Asian Women in Britain, and Dreams, Questions and Struggles. She's a founding member of South Asia Solidarity Group and board member of IMCAN, a Black South Asian and minority ethnic women's organization dedicated to combating violence against women in Britain. So without further ado, Amrit, I'd like to welcome you to take the stage. I think you might be on mute. Hi.
Oh, yeah, okay, fine. Thank you very much, Habiba, and thanks to the Rights Collective for inviting me to this second session on partition. I listened to the first one and it was very interesting. Now, partition, just to recap, led to the displacement of some 15 million people and the deaths of more than 1 million, possibly 2 million people. And that generation who made that journey and experienced terrible and traumatizing violence have mainly passed on. But of course, as we know, intergenerational trauma continues to go on and on. A couple of years back, the BBC had presented programs which were mainly about the pain of people returning to their villages and towns they had left behind, but it said very little about Britain's role in this. Meanwhile, in India, as historian Ravinder Kaur tells us, partition is presented as a historical wound created for display, even dressed up afresh for public consumption. And this makes us realize that the way we retell stories or frame oral history is deeply political. So to make a change, and also because I'm aiming to finish in only 7 minutes, I don't know if I'll succeed, I thought I'd talk about some of the political forces which led up to partition, and to what extent those forces still affect women's experiences today. And to do this, I'd like to go back to 1857, which was India's first war of independence, although in British history books, it's still dismissively called the Mutiny. It was, in fact, an uprising on a massive scale, which went across a vast area of northern India, Pakistan and Bangladesh. It lasted more than 2 years and was a response to 100 years of looting by the East India Company, which had systematically destroyed the economy and impoverished the people. The uprising was also a response to the racism, the violence, the humiliation, and the sheer brutality of British rule. The central driving force of the uprising were the rebelling soldiers of the colonial Indian army, who were mainly Hindus. In addition, there were the feudal aristocracy, there were peasants and unemployed craftspeople whose livelihoods had been destroyed by colonialism, and there were Adivasis, or the indigenous people of India, who were already fighting the British. So it was a very broad demography which had risen up against the British colonizers. But despite this broad democracy, the vast majority of British historians continue even today to portray 1857 as a battle between Islam and Christianity. 1857 was a watershed for British colonial policy. After 1857, the East India Company had ruled with the help of the British. Before 1857, the East India Company had ruled with the help of the British Army. After 1857, the British state took over direct control of India. And they immediately started a policy of divide and rule, because they were afraid of the unity between Hindus and Muslims, which had been demonstrated in 1857. They did everything to destroy that unity. So after 1857, both Hindus and Muslims were systematically encouraged to think that their religion was under threat. And at the same time, Muslims were constantly portrayed as invaders and untrustworthy. This propaganda was everywhere, in colonial papers, in proclamations, and colonial speeches, and in a constant rewriting of history. Hostility between Hindus and Muslims were actively encouraged, and it culminated in the partition of Bengal along religious lines in 1905. This was a really key event in terms of the later partition of India, because though Bengal was reunited in 1911 after mass protests, strikes, and even assassination attempts, the damage had been done. The very next year, in 1912, we can see the emergence of two communal organizations, the Muslim League and the Hindu Mahasabha. And I guess you know what communal means in the South Asian context. That is organizations which were of one religion, but hostile or in conflict with others. Both of these organizations, the Hindu Mahasabha and the Muslim League, deliberately distanced themselves from the anti-colonial struggle, and both were behind the push for partition. While Muhammad Ali Jinnah, leader of the Muslim League, is credited with the idea of partition of India into two separate nations, V.R. Savarkar, ideologue of the Hindu Mahasabha, had floated the idea of two nations 3 years before Jinnah. The Hindu Mahasabha is also interesting for us today because it shared many of its leaders and its ideology with the RSS, which today is the parent body of the controlling force behind the Modi regime under the BJP. The RSS is and always has been openly fascist. In fact, it was inspired by the Nazis and modeled on Mussolini's black shirts. So we can see that there's a direct line from the pro-British, pro-colonial forces, which wanted partition, and today's fascist BJP in India, for all their talk of nationalism. In fact, a statue of Savarkar has been installed in the Indian Parliament. This is a man who is well known for writing that the rape of Muslim women by Hindu men is justifiable. So when partition actually happened, it was after when the British knew that they had to leave or they'd be pushed out after the Quit India movement of 1942. But because no arrangements had been made at all, and partition was left till the last minute, it led to a colossal loss of life. For example, partition was due to take place in August 1948, but it was brought forward by a year because the British were worried that they were going to be pushed out. People were not told which side of the border their homes would fall, and the lawyer responsible for drawing the exact boundaries had no knowledge at all of India. He was given only 5 weeks to complete this incredibly difficult task. And finally, the border was eventually announced after both countries were independent on 17th August. Partition saw the most gruesome and sadistic violence against women. They were gang raped, their bodies were mutilated, they were also killed by their own families because patriarchy deemed that to die was better than being dishonored. This happened to Hindu, Muslim, and Sikh women. Partition showed us that there can be no non-gendered way of understanding that period, because patriarchy rules that women's bodies belong not to themselves, but to their families and communities and even their nation. Rather than mention the many remarkable feminist books on partition, which I think have been touched on in the first session of these talks, what I'd like to do now is try to categorize the different kinds of experiences of women whose lives were so profoundly affected by partition. So we can see that essentially they consisted of displacement, loss of their homes, their familiar surroundings, loss of their loved ones, and violence, often terrible sexual violence. Categorizing their experiences in this way reveals to us the host of similar episodes of horrendous violence in independent India, in which Muslims, Christians, and Dalits have been attacked. And in almost every case, the instigators and perpetrators have been gangs led by the same organizations which were responsible for partition, particularly the RSS. The only exception was the Sikh massacres of 1984, where the RSS were not the chief instigators, but they were complicit. Of all these massacres perpetrated by the RSS, the anti-Muslim pogrom in Gujarat 2002 is the one which has been examined in most detail by feminist historians. So to understand trauma very similar to what women have experienced as a result of partition, we can only look at Gujarat, where, as feminist historian Tanika Sarkar writes, the woman's body was a site of almost inexhaustible violence, with infinitely plural and innovative forms of torture. The traumas faced by the survivors in Gujarat was, if anything, worse than the trauma of partition, because the killers and torturers still roam free in the areas where the women lived, while they themselves spent more than a decade in refugee camps. Many young women have been told, though have not been able to confirm this, were married off to men living in the UK to get them away from Gujarat. History enables us to understand the present. So the history of communal violence from partition to today allows us to understand the violence-ridden climate of India today. The lynchings, murders, and rapes of Muslims and Christians and Dalits, which have been happening on such a massive scale since the BJP came to power. The same far-right communal forces are active in this country too. We must remember that more than being of a particular religion, they are fascists first and foremost. And history shows us that fascism can be confronted and defeated. So I'll leave it there and see what you think of it if you have any questions.
Thanks very much, Amrit, for that presentation. That was really interesting, especially the bit that you mentioned about linking partition to the events in the subcontinent today, which I'm sure a lot of people have questions about. Please feel free to drop your questions in the chat box below, and we will compile those all and ask our speakers at the end. Our next speaker is Dr. Samia Cartoon. Samia is a feminist historian of the British Empire, focusing on the life, worlds and experiences of colonized peoples. Before joining SOAS as a senior lecturer, Samia was associate professor at the University of Liberal Arts, Bangladesh, where she developed one of the first undergraduate history programs in the private university sector in Bangladesh. So thank you very much, Samia, for joining us today.
Thank you so much for facilitating this conversation. I've already learnt so much from what Amrit had to say. Thank you for the introduction. I just wanted to clarify for the audience so you can locate me a little bit. I'm Bangladeshi by spirit and birth, Australian by citizenship, and as you said, a historian by training. And I just moved to the UK last year, so it's quite a different political terrain for me to be speaking to. I'm really sad we couldn't meet in person so I could get a sense of what this collective and this community actually looks like. So what I'm hoping to do today is just speak about the concept of partition as a nice sort of complement to the sort of examples that Amrit has given us of the very concrete ways in which the violence of partition is gendered. And I want to talk about the concept of partition rather than partition as a concrete political event that you can pin down to a particular day at a particular time in the 20th century. And in part, I'm taking this approach because if you consider the experience of partition from Bangladesh, then the date of 1947 actually just doesn't have the same significance as from India and Pakistan. It has significance, but just doesn't have that punch, right? Because in popular historical consciousness in Bangladesh, partition is understood as a process that starts in 1905 with the division of Bengal, and in Bangladeshi historical consciousness, 1905 is actually seen as quite a positive thing, in quite stark contrast to India. And you know, it's not as if it's seen as positive across the political spectrum always, but it's seen as the beginning of the process that is going to culminate in 1971 with the creation of independent Bangladesh. So these moments have very different valences depending on which bit of South Asia you're looking from. So that's one reason I want to kind of step back from the actual political eventness of partition and think more about the architecture of thought. And the second reason I'm doing this is because I'm a historian of the 19th and 18th century. And in those earlier centuries, you start to see the idea of partition structuring absolutely everything and profoundly starting to structure how people are going to talk about gender, and people are going to talk about feminist projects, and people are going to talk about gendered violence. So usually we're used to thinking about partition as a geographical ordering, so a sort of mapping of religious communities to nation space. Now, what I want to suggest today is actually it's also a temporal ordering. It's actually also very much about time. Now, so I don't get too abstract here, I've got some nice pictures for you to lead you through what I mean by this. But before I get to them, I'm going to talk today about the concept of progress and progressive movements. So I wanted people to use their chat boxes to just indicate who in this audience would consider themselves progressives. Can put a yes or a plus or a at least 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Okay. So we have a number of people in this audience who would say, yep, we belong to progressive social movements, we belong to progressive political projects. So what I want to do today is actually kind of deeply unsettle what the baggage is that comes with, and how that's deeply connected to the architecture of thought of partition. Okay, and again, we can come back if there's things I'm saying that don't make any sense, we can come back to it in the question and answer. Okay, so I'm just going to share my screen now. There we go. This, can you see this? Is that visible, that arrow? Habiba?
Hi, Syma. Yes, we can see your screen.
Okay, great, fantastic. Sorry, new to the technology. So before I get to what partition and temporality in the South Asian context looks like, I want to actually start not in South Asia but in Britain, and a story that connects this architecture of partition thought to Britain as well, because often we are also thinking about partition as something that's happening over there in South Asia, and it's not, we don't really know how to connect it to what's going on in the West. Now, the very idea of progress and progressive movements comes from this profoundly sort of racialized story of movement from savagery to civilization, a movement through time from the East to the West. In the context of Britain, or in the context of Australia, which is where my consciousness is sort of produced, the narrative that you often will come across is this idea that, you know, humanity starts in Africa and with Africa or indigenous peoples, and then the torch of civilization moves to South Asia and Middle Eastern peoples. Then the torch of civilization progresses to white civilization, and then you arrive at civilization. Now, this is one of those narratives that is so deeply encoded in our thinking about the modern world and our thinking about how time is progressing, that we usually don't even think about it. And here, what the arrow here, what I've done is actually shown you what the racial hierarchy is underpinning that story. It's always about Africans and Indigenous people being lesser than South Asians and Middle Eastern people, who are lesser than white civilization, right? So it's a racial hierarchy. Now, the way that gender works in this story and narrative here is gender and the status of women operates in this body of thought as a marker of where you are in the march to civilization. So, you know, you will all be familiar with, you know, these claims that we're going into Afghanistan to save Muslim women. Now, underpinning that idea, of course, is that Muslim women are somewhere back there. Muslim women are women who are in a society somewhere back there, and white civilization can go in there to save them and bring them out into civilization. Okay, so what happens in the process of the East India Company sort of arriving in South Asia and colonizing vast swathes of space is these narratives of progress get mapped onto South Asian pasts. Now, one of the most important books that does this is James Mills's The History of British India. And this is one of the books that many, many, many people are reading before they arrive in South Asia as East India Company officers. So it's a textbook, right? If you look at this book, what it does is it divides the South Asian past into three categories. There's the ancient period of Hindu golden rule, and then there's the medieval period of Muslim rule, and then there is the period of enlightened British rule. Okay, so it's even divided into books that are going to be the Hindu period, the Muslim period, the British enlightened period. So you end up getting something that looks like this. There we go. And so what you start to see from these very early textbooks that the colonizing forces are reading is actually the idea of partition, but mapped out over time, okay? So you're going to get the Hindus at the very beginning, and it's a sharp thing, and it's Muslims in the middle, and then enlightened British rule. What's going to happen is the British argument is going to be that upon arrival to South Asia, we found a terrible society that was in Muslim decline, and through British rule, we are going to get this society back to that period of ancient golden era of Hinduism. Now, this is, of course, precisely the narrative that underpins the sort of Hindutva narrative today about a return to an era of ancient rule, an era of ancient golden rule. Now, what is absolutely fascinating is this story, upon India, Pakistan, Bangladesh being created as independent states, this story gets appropriated in different ways. So in India, the story becomes there was a period of ancient Hindu rule, then there was the bad Muslims, and now we are going to return in the period of independence to ancient golden rule. In Pakistan, it gets switched around. This architecture stays the same, but it gets switched around, where there was a terrible period of Hindu dark rule, then there was a great period of Muslim golden rule, and then the British arrived and ruined everything, and now we need to get back to this period of golden Muslim rule. So you see the story, the partitioning of the past stays the same, but it's sort of just switched around depending on where you are in relation to the borders. And in Bangladesh, something very interesting happens where both these stories, both the sort of Indian hegemonic story and the Pakistani hegemonic story, are in play. So, just as women operate as the status markers of where you are along in this story of progress, in the South Asian case, you also very much becomes women and gendered violence and narratives about women actually determine apparently where you are on this scale of progress towards this state of independence and civilization. Now, this has really, really, really big implications for any kind of feminist project and any kind of narrative about gender that we, as people deeply committed to social justice projects, might want to undertake. So, for instance, the earliest case where some of the templates of how gender becomes problematic in this schema of thinking is, of course, widow burning. Now, almost every single one of your important feminist Indian historian or South Asian historian will go and write about widow burning or sati or immolation as the moment that, it's sort of this practice where religion, Brahminical religion, Hinduism, is seen as backwards, and there is something to do with women that needs to be changed in order for the civilization to move forward. And in order to move forward, we must leave religion in the background. That's the formulation. And what ends up happening in this process again and again and again is many feminist projects from that moment on, whether it's feminist projects or just pro-women projects, are going to say that it's about becoming enlightened and more Western or more British or more modern and moving away from South Asianness that is actually connected to the liberation of women. And it's about progressing away from our South Asianness to, a more sort of deracinated, liberated self. So I want to just sort of, my purpose today was to just kind of throw some provocative thoughts out there about what it means to be progressive and how it's actually deeply tied to the temporality of partition, and it's actually very, very, very difficult to call yourself as part of progressive movements without re-inscribing those ideas about religion and moving forward and onwards. I want to end by just mentioning, I suggested that James Mill in his History of British India is one of the key places where this story of partitioning between Hindus, Muslims and enlightened cells happens. One of the things that, of course, happens with British rule is that South Asian elites stop having any kind of relationship to South Asian history books themselves, right? So there's actually many other stories of how widow burning or immolation is happening that no one reads anymore after British rule is instituted. And if you look at those types of history books, you actually get very different stories to the story of progress. And for example, in the 9th century Akbar al-Sin wa al-Hind, which is it's an Arabic treatise by merchants who are coming and looking at South Asia and trading with South Asia. It's got lots and lots and lots of accounts of immolation, or what's later called widow burning. However, the fascinating thing is, in those accounts, it's not only women who burn themselves. When a king dies, when a sovereign dies, wives are burning themselves, but also many other people who are choosing, who are not women, who are going to go and burn themselves. And the text says that it gives a reason for the immolation, and this is a 9th century text, and it says, quote, "There are people who burn themselves to death with fire. This stems from their belief in the transmigration of souls." Now, what's fascinating here is when colonial rulers, when colonial officers, or when colonial visitors are going to come to South Asia, they're going to record it as they're going to only record the bit which is about gender. They're not going to record the bits which are not about gender. It actually points to a very profound moment where, through colonial eyes, they're going to see the status of women, because it's about being able to pin South Asia to a sort of earlier stage in civilizational progress. So it's a very complex set of things I've tried to cram in today, but I just want to end by saying that social justice feminist projects that are interested and committed to decolonizing how we talk about gender in South Asia, we actually have to address this underpinning architecture of progress and its deep interconnectedness with narratives of communalism. There's no way around it, in my opinion. Okay, I'll leave it there.
Thank you so much, Samia. That was really, really interesting. I'm sure lots of people would agree as well. They've been dropping comments on the chat about how, this idea of progressiveness is actually situated deeply in whiteness as well, which you also conveyed in your presentation there. So thanks so much, Samia. Our last speaker is Syma Tariq. Syma is a PhD researcher based at the Centre for Creative Research into Sound Arts Practice at the University of Arts London. Her academic work is concerned with the artifactualization of voices and archives and silences produced by colonial erasure using the 1947 partition as a sonic environment and limits case. She has had an interest in sound and its relation to politics by way of her experience in radio journalism, music promotion, and exhibitions in Europe and South Asia. So thanks very much, Syma, whenever you're ready.
Hi, thank you, Habiba, and for the Rights Collective for this invitation. And also, I'm very nervous to speak after Amrit and Samia, whose work I really admire and have followed, so I'm going to do my best. So I'll speak a little bit and then I will share some slides as well. So I'll just go into it, I think. So yeah, as Habiba said, my work is testimony and voices. And as we all know, I think there's been a growth in oral history work and testimony gathering related to partition in recent years. We also know that partition as a historical category is still, as made clear by the previous two talks, deeply unstable. So my current research refocuses on partition through the unstable practice of listening, not just to the testimony gathered and collected, but also to the post-colonial context in which this, what I call artifactualization of voices occurs. So I'm going to try and share a slide. Can everybody see that?
Yes.
Great. So the collection of testimony, which is more urgent as partition witnesses age, and as Amrit mentioned, many of them have passed away, it takes on many forms and depths. So as well as being collected and analyzed for books, played on the radio, recorded for film, TV, documentary, and special BBC series and stuff like that, partition's oral archival turn is booming. And so, this is what my concern is with the kind of the voices in the archive, right? So this archival, which also includes this kind of museological surge, seems to imply that the taboo surrounding partition has apparently lessened. Now, we all know that there's probably, I'll get into that later. So for being based at a research center that's concerned with sound, I've been able to understand how useful and challenging the idea of listening is and can be as a research practice, which is relevant obviously for sound studies and sound art, but for historical research too, I think. So you don't need a PhD to note the connection between partition and listening. Oral history, storytelling, and memory making through testimonies within partition's sonic environment comprise complex networks of orality and oral cultures. So these also include, as mentioned by the previous two speakers or alluded to, these kind of inherited silences that come out from the framing of how we think about it. So approaching all of this requires, I think, an acknowledgement of the contingent and intersubjective nature of listening. Right. So for my currently delayed fieldwork, so I've started sort of precursory visits, but not really started the proper fieldwork yet, but I aim to listen at 3 archives. So the British Empire and Commonwealth Museum Collection in Bristol, the Citizens Archive of Pakistan in Karachi, and the International Institute for Social History's South Asia Collection in Amsterdam. So all 3 archives hold audio testimony relating to partition, if not about the happening or the event itself, then the subjective experiences of time and space before and after independence. So centering the sonic in this kind of research on partition provides scope for meaningful connections, not least because a critical study of partition's oral archival turn is still lacking, likely because it's relatively recent, with relevant strands of sound studies also emergent. It is the beginning of a broader critical engagement that will hopefully be relevant to the study of any post-colonial context or study where recorded testimony occupies the historical record. Oh, sorry, I skipped the slide there, but I'll keep it there. So these are some of the sort of examples of what I'm talking about in this archival turn. And as you can see, there's a lot of kind of the stuff that's happened recently. So what's notable is this dynamic nature of the archiving. So the collection, digitization, and curation of testimony, which is ongoing, with these collections that are often traveling as part of exhibitions or shared digitally. Any one of these archives can hold up to thousands of hours of audio, also meaning that my own fieldwork and my own research cannot aim to be fully representative of partition's oral archival turn or sonic environment, particularly as I will unlikely get a visa to India anytime soon, as a British Pakistani. So, however, compared to, say, studying a fixed collection of objects in an archive or a museum collection, partition's oral archives and the complexities and variations found within them provide a rich opportunity to address testimony beyond the written text and towards a history through voice. And this, importantly, addresses the codified and non-codified practices of speaking and listening that surround our understandings of this history. So these are some of the sort of feminist oral history texts that I'm hoping to sort of revive as part of my PhD. So considering that partition history can be so complex and unwieldy, listening seems like a perhaps abstract but also apt methodology, particularly in my view from a feminist perspective. And here the revival of feminist thinkers such as Battaglia and Das and Menon are crucial. In their work, rendered in text rather than in sound, notions of honor, shame, nation, and progress, all these things that have been mentioned before, as well as cultural notions of family, womanhood, motherhood, and of course, the looming kind of horror of violence, the mass violence against women, are filled out through deeply intersubjective exchanges, sometimes over long periods of time. So Veena Das's book, for example, doesn't contrast to the experience of women who not only survived partition, but also survived the 1984 riots in Delhi, but she sort of treats it as a kind of continuum as well. And that creates a very interesting sort of anthropological approach as well. So this potentially radical nature of listening as this engaged and contingent practice is one that can help chart perhaps how we are guided to listen to partition and who that we is. So locating the silenced voice, the unsilenced through two separate engagements with listening, for me, one to the testimonies held in the archive, the other to those who produce and work with those testimonies, I believe promotes the development of political strategies as well as research strategies that go beyond the forms and norms of history as we know it as a discipline. So that comes to the sound part. So this is the first episode of a series of works where my art practice has met my research thinking. And this was a very recent sort of commission for Nottingham Contemporary, which I produced during the lockdown. So initially I was supposed to go to Nottingham and just talk about my PhD. And in the end, I ended up making these sort of audio essays. And so I've done two, and a third one is going to come out in December. So as I mentioned, these multiple silences that travel through Partition's oral archives do so across gender, caste, and class lines, with certain voices and narratives making up the bulk of received knowledge through the collection of personal stories. Erasure is ever present, partly due to the lack of official records, which has often lazily been put down to the chaos of 1947, or even the incapacity of those in South Asia to even keep records. But amid all those devastating fires of 1947, one was very deliberately started by the British. Outside the Delhi government building in August 1947, one colonial office official noted that the local press greatly enjoyed themselves with the pall of smoke which hung over Delhi during the mass destruction of documents. This fire lasted for days and kickstarted a long-term strategy of concealment and destruction throughout the British Empire across the world as it dissolved. So the astonishing tampering with and destruction of evidence undertaken by the UK National Archives and the Foreign and Commonwealth Office, and I think some of us might be aware of that because of the Mau Mau case that was recently put into the public eye, with the Kenya massacres. So this kind of destruction of evidence during British decolonization and since, starting with British India, must be taken as a genealogical precursor to any attempt of mine at partitioned listening. Not only because some of the only evidence we have left are voices, but also because colonial terms and categories are still prevalent in terms of how we speak about and listen to partition stories, how we refer to binary categories and events, terms such as riots, communalism, and so on, which are colonial categories which deserve their own sort of etymological study. This is the next one, which is slightly more fun to listen to as it's more about song and performance. So this series became for me an exercise in complex listening and thinking about voices as evidence. So using field recordings, archival footage, performance, and testimony, among other sonic elements. Listening, as feminist historians and thinkers have made clear for decades, necessitates care, time, and endurance. It's difficult enough to listen to what's being said on this complex and fraught history, let alone listen out for these silences in stereo, to use Battaglia's descriptions of how she listens to women. So this is the challenge, how colonial erasure and ongoing patriarchy affects our understanding of history, but also how it affects our listening. It seems like we're constantly breaking the silence, and I know that this is a sort of one of the Rights Collective's sort of stated goals. But we must understand that there are many types of silences that need breaking, and in some cases, maybe certain silences are not even ours to break. So this is especially stark in an age of hardening division, surveillance, censorship, and movement towards the far right in many parts of the world. So a citizen oral historian in Kolkata recently told me that his interviews with partition witnesses recently have been really difficult because many of them did not want to show him any of their documents or papers. And this is obviously in the context of the NRC and Modi's Hindu nationalist policies that make non-citizens of those deemed to have non-normative, non-Indian backgrounds. It's clear for me then that partition, sort of away from our ordinary notions of time and event, which is something that Samia touched on, it's become a space where it has become permissible to speak about perhaps previously unspeakable things. But the onus of speaking on survivors and witnesses counterpoints a potential refusal to speak as well. And so I think about this in terms of Nikita Dhawan's thinking on liberal and hegemonic norms of legibility. So as critical historians, artists, and researchers, and general public, we must think about who is being asked to speak, for who and why. But we must also think about who's listening, and that the meaning of any speech is tangled up with our listening, to our implicatedness in the complex spatio-temporal spaces where we find ourselves listening. With that, I thank you for listening.
Thank you, Syma. That was really interesting there, the linkages between partition and sound. I've linked both of your podcasts in the chat box function so people can have a listen. And I think I mentioned via email already, we actually included part 1 of your podcast on our resources hub, which I think I mentioned via email. So please, everyone, feel free to check that out. It's really, really interesting. Thank you to all of our speakers. I'd now like to open the floor to any questions, if anybody has any. You can unmute yourself and ask the speakers directly, or drop it in the chat box function, and we can sort of work our way through those. I'd like to start, if that's okay. This is a question to all of our speakers. You can sort of chip in at various points if you wish, but I wanted to ask, what do you think are some of the legacies of partition today, and how partition is remembered in the subcontinent, especially as Amrit mentioned, you know, Modi's India and the BJP party? What do you think are some of the legacies today?
I can jump in if no one else wants to. I think one of the really, really profound legacies for every single person of South Asian ancestry, both in South Asia and in the diaspora, is that we are today all partitioned subjects. There's no way of escaping that we have internalized the divisions and categories with which partition has sort of played out. So, you know, if you go and look at sort of early 18th century and earlier images, writing, people do not ask themselves the question, am I Hindu or Muslim? It's not even remotely a question that question doesn't make sense. So for someone like myself who identifies as a Muslim woman, the legacy of what partition has meant for even my definition of what is Islam or what is Muslim is absolutely profound. It's an almost daily negotiation of partitioning off the other legacies that my family and my world are inheritors to, which is the Sanskritic Indic, which is the Buddhist, which is the Christian, which is the range of other different knowledges that my family have inherited. Yet we must be partitioned Muslims because that's how modern Islam has shaped itself in the wake of partition. So I think that on a very day-to-day basis of subjectivity, identity, political consciousness, we are all partitioned subjects now.
Yeah.
I'd just like to add a bit to that. I want to talk about the diaspora first and foremost in this context. Now, I remember when I first came to this country, which was in the 60s, it was noticeable that although there were divisions between Indians and Pakistanis, those divisions were certainly not as marked as they are now. And personally, I don't think it was only, I think, of course, now because of the BJP and the way Pakistan has developed, these divisions have become very acute. But I think there were other factors as well. And one of them was the whole policy of multiculturalism, which created these divisions. And then after that, the policy of faith communities, single faith communities, which actually encouraged these divisions, creating, different radio programs even, although you have the same songs in them, this is the irony of it. So I think, we can't put all the blame onto partition. I think partition maybe started a process which has gone right on. As I was mentioning, certainly the context of India, that was when we first saw the actions of the far right Hindu organizations. So I think it's fairly important to notice that. And if you actually also look at the Dalit experience in this country, I'm told that in the early days, it was less acute than it is now. So I think these are all factors we've got to understand. We can't put everything down to partition.
In terms of, sorry if I can jump in, the question of the legacies, I mean, there are so many, but for me, and maybe it's because of sort of my research obsessions at the moment, I do feel that there is such a glaring silence about, and a kind of obfuscation of kind of colonial complicity and sort of destruction. And so the archives is one thing where they were literally burning papers, but then, I mean, it's something I always come back to. So recently we had, the thing of the statues, right? So Edward Colston's statue was sort of thrown into the river, and then the resurfacing of Afua Hirsch's piece in The Guardian about we should take down Nelson's column and all of that. And I was walking into and it's something that sort of I mentioned in one of the audio pieces. Right next to Nelson is a statue of Henry Havelock, right? And he was the general in charge during the 1857 mutiny. And it says that very clearly in the inscription on the, you can go see it. It's like it's not the most famous statue in Trafalgar Square, but it's there. And I mean, it's sort of, part of me was just like, I mean, we should just, South Asia Solidarity Group, maybe we should all go and protest that statue too at the same time, like, I think this silencing, and sort of, because there's been so many cases around the world where oral history especially has affected change, in South Africa, in Latin America, in Australia, in some instances, I think, where people are working with indigenous voices, and that kind of leads to land reclamation, cases. So yeah, I'm wondering if that legacy of silence could somehow be overturned if we sort of look what's happening in other post-colonial contexts, and even look what's happening in our city. So people are tearing down statues or questioning them at least.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think that's so true. I mean, South Asia Solidarity Group, we've had our eye on that statue for a long time.
Oh, good.
I think it's really time we did something about it.
Absolutely, yeah. Amrit, I think you mentioned earlier, the Dalit experience of partition. And to my sort of knowledge, there hasn't been much research done in that sort of area. Do you have any sort of commentary on that? Because the Dalit experience is from mainstream.
I don't have a huge amount of knowledge about it, but what I do know comes again from the work of Ravinder Kaur, and she's written about the way in which the refugee resettlement programs were carried out, particularly in Delhi, where Dalits were actually asked to live in a kind of apartheid-like situation in mud huts in the middle of the city, in a place called Karol Bagh in Delhi. Whereas people of higher caste were eventually settled and given proper accommodation. So, there were huge divisions. I mean, and I think the Dalit experience varied, in both parts of the partition arena. So, I mean, there are cases I've been told of Dalit women particularly being pushed to the front because they would not be attacked by Muslims, which of course was not true. And at the same time, they faced the violence of the upper caste during that whole journey. So, it was, it's a very important part of that partition story, but it's only just being looked at, I think, now.
We have a question from Sab here, and she says, when Amrit mentioned about the British creating divisions, was there a particular point when this was heightened before partition?
Well, as I said, and I think also Samia mentioned to a certain extent, the key turning point was 1857, because they realized that if there was unity between Hindus and Muslims, they could no longer rule a country, you know. So that's when it all started. And then it carried right on all through till partition. I mean, it became like a colonial fact that Muslims were invaders, that, you know, they were separate, that they were endangering the Hindu religion, and to an extent vice versa as well, that, you know, the Muslim religion was also under threat. So I don't know if there was a point just before partition, but I think it was firmly established by then, let's put it that way.
Okay. We have a question from Nahida. What do you hope can be achieved through amplifying the voices of marginalized South Asian women, both in the context of South Asia today, as well as accountability from Britain? That's a great question. Thanks, Nahida.
I'm going to try, if that's okay. Yeah, I think that's a really good question. I'm actually working on sort of a summer school next year with some colleagues from different universities on this thing on marginal voices, right? And they're working in different contexts, from Northern Ireland to Austria, and, you know, and we sort of stopped in our tracks, because then we were sort of all discussing what we actually meant by marginalized. And I think it's really important to first define that term, like marginalized for who. And I guess I'm supposing in this forum where all of us here, we can assume what we mean by marginalized South Asian women, right? But I do think this thing of amplifying voices, I think it's often a quite its own sort of violence, especially of liberalism, to amplify voices, you know, for certain reasons. So I think for us to do it in a way that's not, you know, encroaching or appropriating other people's suffering for funding, for our research, for our careers, for an exhibition, you know, I don't know how to answer. But I think it's a really good point. Yeah, I think it's a really good point.
Can I just jump in there? Sorry. I just wanted to say that the voices which we should be amplifying are the voices of struggle, you know, which are happening in countries which are increasingly, you know, the struggles are silenced and crushed. So I think in that context, that's where those are the voices of the marginalized, which we need to amplify and emphasize. And of course, you know, who is marginalized depends on a situation and a particular country. I mean, certainly in India, you have to talk about many Muslims as marginalized, so or as Kashmiris as marginalized. And I feel it's our duty really to amplify those voices in the interest of justice.
Absolutely. I think there's a question for Samia from Nishma. I'm not sure if you can read it, Samia. It's a pretty long one.
Yep.
Sorry, that's my fault. Shall I read it out myself?
That's fine. I can read it. But could I just add to the last question, just very, very briefly? One of the things that I wanted to say about marginalized voices was, in the Bangladeshi context anyway, when you see the various different narratives of partition playing out, one of the strands that you never, ever, 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 ever see is what are working class experiences of partition, or it's a profoundly middle class discourse. And I'm complicit in the profound middle classness of South Asian academia and South Asian intellectual worlds. And, you know, after I agreed to appear on this panel, I had a really long sort of navel-gazing moment of, I'm Bangladeshi, but I'm not British Bangladeshi, and British Bangladeshi people here, it's a profoundly working class community, and I wonder what the working class perspective on the political communities that come out of partition up, because in many ways, particularly if you compare Australia and Bangladesh, it becomes very obvious that, you know, political parties in Australia are the Labor Party and the Liberal Party. It's along class lines. The emergence of political participation in Bangladesh doesn't happen in the same way along class lines, it seems. Anyway, so you know, I don't know what is possible by promoting marginalised voices, but I think one that's really, really, really missing from some of these partition literatures or historiography is definitely South Asian working class voices. So I'd like to see more of that. And there was a question, you mentioned, a question for me, you mentioned that social justice feminist projects must think about and challenge the underpinning architecture of progress and it's interconnected with narratives of communalism. What do you think this means from a practical perspective for those of us working in social justice spaces? What are some actions we can take or questions we can start asking ourselves? So actually, I mean, that's a really good question and it's a really hard question. So I'm someone who was in social justice spaces, then stepped back and went away and did this history PhD and wrote a book to actually address some of these architectures of thought that were really problematic in social justice language. And now it's a moment where, you know, how do you then take that thought forward and turn it into praxis? And in some ways it's about having, I don't know the answer, but it's about actually having presence in social justice movements and in struggle, as Amrit said. It's sort of how on earth you imagine better futures without using the logic and architecture of thought of progress. I don't think anyone knows the answer to that one, because it's you would fundamentally have to actually rethink the project of modernity. That's how big it is. But, you know, like, there's key places that I think you can do this rethinking. One very key place is in thinking about development discourse. Development discourse and gender and development discourse is one of the places where that progress narrative and gender in its problematic formulation is perpetuated in one of the most powerful ways. So, you know, how do you think about textile workers without falling into gender and development language? But I think it's one of those things that has to be worked out in praxis. So I don't have an answer today, except to say there's a willingness to, you know, actually work this stuff out through struggle in concrete social justice projects, from my part anyway.
Can I just add to that very briefly? I think it's very important for us to actually be clear what we mean by social justice project, you know, because I mean, they, in many places, I believe in Bangladesh, although I'm not sure of this, a lot of them are essentially NGOs. And I think a lot of NGOs, like, for example, Action Aid and so on, you know, these are, well, I mean, if you think that some of the biggest NGOs are far more wealthy than many nations, you know, we have to understand that NGOs, they may talk of social justice, but really they're not delivering social justice. So I think we have to be pretty wary about that. The other thing, which is kind of related to it, but in a way like adds to what Samia was saying about progress and so on. I think, you know, one thing we must realize is that there has been a lot of work done by Indian historians and academics from the left and feminist writers, which actually does challenge the Western view. And I think for us to fall into the trap of saying that feminists don't challenge that is not very fair to them. And also, you know, in Britain, we tend not to read those books. We tend, for example, to read William Dalrymple when we should be reading Rajat Kant Roy, who is written about 1857 and all of these details. And similarly, the feminist historians like Kumkum Sangari or a host of others who have written about sati have not fallen into the trap of the progress narrative. So it's important for us to acknowledge that and actually read those books.
Thank you, Amrit. We have a question from Anissa here. She asks, why are we silent in our legacy? I think that could tie in nicely with Syma Tariq's work with sound, because you mentioned, Syma, you know, sometimes silences aren't meant to be spoken. Some women might not want to speak out because of, you know, trauma associated with partition and the memories that come with that. Is Syma still on the call? I think.
She dropped off. Sorry, I've just let her back in again. So maybe you can ask the question again.
Sorry about that. I'm back.
Hi, Syma. So we had a question from Anissa, and she asks, why are we silent in our legacy? And I thought maybe you could answer that based on your sort of work around sound and partition, and how you said earlier in your presentation how sometimes silences aren't supposed to be, you know, spoken about, because some women might not want to talk about the horrors of partition and the trauma associated with that.
So, I mean, there's many different silences, I suppose. And so this is, I mean, the gendered side, I mean, I've not really done a lot of work yet on gender, although I've been reading these sort of feminist historians. And one thing that really came out of it for me was this issue of care and this issue of listening. And I think what Samia said about all of us being partitioned subjects, and I mean, my project's called Partitioned Listening, and, you know, we have partitioned archives and, you know, partitioned knowledge. And I think that's a lot of division to undo, you know. And I think we can't speak about the kind of silence, or I think there was another, I've lost all my chat history now, but there was a question about, you know, why haven't South Asians done anything, or why haven't South Asians sort of worked on it? I think there have been, definitely. But I think that it's just been really difficult for us as sort of fragmented subjectivities, and especially as diaspora, to sort of grapple with all of these things. So I don't really have an answer for that, but I think it's really important that we keep asking why, and also understand that the sort of silence doesn't necessarily come out of, you know, submission. And I also think there's many people who don't want to be public, who don't want to speak, and that often means that work and resistance can be done in a better way, right? Especially now with the sort of age that we're living in and the surveillance, etc. Yeah, I hope that answered a little bit.
Thank you, Syma. Another question from me perhaps. What are the ways in which you have seen the narratives of partition being utilised in today's nationalistic projects by politicians and others, especially the case in India and maybe elsewhere? What have been your sort of experiences, your thoughts on how rhetoric of partition, you know, divide and rule and labelling certain groups, have you seen sort of a revival of this today?
Shall I go?
Yeah.
I find that in the UK, which is really my perspective as much as I spend time and work in Pakistan, but every time there's a 0 at the end of an anniversary year, there's this flood of sort of content and radio stuff and TV stuff. And I think Amrit said it at the very beginning of her talk. It's like it's created as this sort of devastating horror, like almost like a natural catastrophe, you know. And so do you think that and I mean, but in Pakistan, I mean, partition, I mean, it's seen as independence. So I mean, when I was there for it's Independence Day, you know. Pakistan Day is a different day, and I'm not really sure why that is. Maybe someone here can answer that. So yeah, I definitely think that the silence thing comes back again, but I do think that the partition is like a byword for like unspeakable horror, you know, for many of us, and especially in the West. It's sort of, and that's why I think this, like, sort of attaching it, even if I'm not particularly good at evidencing my hunches, perhaps yet, maybe at the end of the PhD I should be, but sort of constantly attaching it to this idea of coloniality. And I think this kind of thing of modernity as well, like we did not have modernity without coloniality. We did not have development without colonialism, you know. So all these things kind of tie back to it. And I think partition, we must sort of think about that in the same way too. So yeah.
Yeah, agreed. Thank you, Syma. Amrit or Samia, would you like to add any more thoughts to that?
I mean, the Indian context most recently, I think, has been the most obvious big one. But in the Bangladesh context, I think the Rohingya issue is never, ever even seen as a partition, an ongoing partition, but it very much is. That border between Myanmar and Bangladesh is this space where the violence of partition is playing out again and again and again. It's sort of, so from the end of the Myanmar government, you just repeatedly see the narrative about these people don't exist. And when I was teaching in Dhaka, one of the most incredible things was, because there's so much migration between Dhaka and Myanmar back and forth, and families that span across that border, lots of my students had the state Myanmar line where they would come to class and say, the Rohingya don't really exist, ma'am. And I'd be like, what do you mean? There's thousands and thousands of people camped out on that border. And so the violences of partition look like quite a different configuration from that end, and that border's one that it would really sharpen our understanding of how we critique partition if that was included more in the discussion as well.
I think I'd just like to add, following on from Samia, that the other area, of course, is Kashmir, and what's happened in Kashmir is a direct result of partition. And we never think about that. And in fact, there was a horrendous episode of Muslims being expelled from Jammu, just like almost continuously after partition. And some of those women went to what is now Azad Kashmir. And many, I think, have come to this country. I mean, I have certainly spoken to many women who had silences, as Syma puts it. I mean, this is so important, and those silences in some ways speak more than words.
Absolutely. I think we might have time for one more question if anybody has anything to ask to our speakers today. Please feel free to unmute yourself or type it out in the chat function below. Just really quickly then, Samia, you mentioned, the Rohingya there. I have another question about the Bihari people in Bangladesh who have sort of also been erased from the partition discourse, and Bangladesh hasn't really released any sort of press release or anything really to address their concerns there. Do you have any sort of thoughts on that? How can we sort of move forward and also give them redress?
Look, the category of Bihari and the space that the non-Bengali citizens of Bangladesh occupy are very much the sort of, it's an incredibly precarious and sort of marginal position in society there. And the historical consciousness is so completely and utterly different and other. I don't actually currently know what kind of violence the Bihari community in Bangladesh is facing. It's just absolutely patently obvious that they're at the margins and the sort of fringes of the nation's space. But yeah, I can't quite comment on that, only just to say that this is it's one of those incredibly terrible realities that absolutely this is almost the experience that defines South Asia is of these these profoundly violent experiences of ongoing partition that are in no way over for the majority of people in an everyday way and internally for everyone. Sorry, that didn't really answer your question about Biharis, but the answer is I don't actually know.
No, I mean, it's a really complex history, so I guess I have to read up more on that as well. Thank you, Samia, for attempting to answer the question. That was really interesting. I don't think we have any other questions, or maybe people are feeling a little shy, but I'd like to thank everyone for attending, and thank you to Amrit, Samia and Syma for giving up their time and speaking this evening. I really appreciate it. To find out more about our future events, you can sign up to our newsletter and follow us on our social media platforms, the links to which are being posted in the chat now by Nishma. And we look forward to seeing you all again soon. So thank you so much, and take care of yourselves. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.